There is a certain kind of person who has mastered the art of appearing completely fine. They laugh at the right moments. They show up on time. They hold other people's pain with remarkable care. But alone, in the quiet spaces between one thing and the next, they are still a child standing in a hallway listening for sounds that tell them what kind of night it is going to be. They built themselves out of whatever materials were available. Resilience fashioned from necessity. Warmth constructed in the absence of it. They are some of the most capable, most empathic, most quietly extraordinary people in any room. But they carry something invisible with them everywhere, a weight assembled in childhood that no amount of adult success has yet been able to fully set down. But if you know someone like this, or if you are someone like this, then you already know that the phrase broken home does not begin to describe it. Because what was broken was not just a household. What was broken was the first template the brain ever had for what safety, love, and belonging were supposed to look like. Today we are going to decode the psychology of people who grew up in a broken home. Why the childhood environment rewires the developing brain in ways that follow a person silently into adulthood. How it shows up in their relationships, their fears, and their deepest habits. And most importantly, what genuine healing actually looks like for people who were shaped by instability before they were old enough to understand it. So why does a difficult childhood leave marks that last so far beyond it? Why do some people grow up in hard circumstances and seem to move through adulthood untouched, while others carry the architecture of those early years in every relationship, every fear, every moment of unexpected panic? The answer, as neuroscience and developmental psychology together reveal, comes from two sources that often overlap. The first source is neurological. Some children are born with sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS, the trait identified by psychologist Elaine Aron that defines the highly sensitive person, or HSP. Their nervous systems process experience at a depth that others do not reach. In a stable home, this depth is a gift. In an unstable one, it means every argument, every silence, every slammed door is recorded not just in memory but in the body, at a cellular level of knowing. The second source is environmental. Picture a child who never knew which version of home they were returning to each afternoon. Some days the house was warm and laughing. Other days it was cold and pressurized, full of a silence that had weight. That child learned to read the atmosphere the moment they crossed the threshold, scanning for signals the way a weather instrument scans for pressure changes, because getting it wrong had real consequences. In both cases, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection and emotional memory center, becomes overdeveloped relative to the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning, regulation, and calm decision-making. When a child's environment is unpredictable, the amygdala grows dominant because survival depends on it. The brain optimizes for danger detection, not for peace, because peace was never a reliable enough condition to optimize for. What began as adaptation became architecture. The hyper-alert child who learned to sense trouble before it arrived grew into an adult whose nervous system is still listening for it. The child who learned to manage a parent's mood grew into an adult who manages everyone's mood, instinctively, exhaustingly, before anyone has asked them to. The survival strategies did not expire when childhood ended. They simply changed their clothes. So when this enters adult life, it does not announce itself as childhood pain. It announces itself as chronic anxiety in relationships that should feel safe. It announces itself as an inexplicable need to leave before being left. It announces itself as an extraordinary capacity to nurture others and a profound difficulty accepting nurture in return. It looks like personality. But it began as protection. The first thing that shapes them most visibly in adult life is a deep, cellular fear of abandonment that activates not in response to actual loss, but in response to the faintest possibility of it. A partner does not reply to a message for 2 hours. By the end of the first hour, something ancient has already been woken in their chest. They do not know why. The relationship is good. Nothing has happened. But their nervous system has run the calculation 1,000 times before and arrived at the same conclusion. People leave. The only question is when. This fear is maintained by a hyperactive amygdala that has been conditioned, through years of unpredictable attachment, to treat relational uncertainty as a genuine threat. It does not distinguish between a partner who is simply busy and a parent who is genuinely unreliable. To the amygdala, ambiguity is danger. And so it fires with an urgency that the present moment has done nothing to earn. The emotional consequence is that they often push people away in the very act of trying to hold them close. They text again. They seek reassurance. They read too deeply into tone. And then they feel ashamed of needing what they need, because somewhere along the way they were taught that needing too much was the reason people left. And that shame around need pulls them directly into the second pattern, which is that they are extraordinarily skilled at taking care of everyone around them and profoundly uncomfortable being taken care of themselves. A friend is in crisis and they show up completely, practically, emotionally, without being asked. But when their own life is difficult, they deflect every offer of support with a quick "I'm fine" and a subject change. They will accept help for logistics, but genuine emotional care feels like a trap whose terms they do not yet understand. So they move through hard seasons alone, performing competence, quietly starving. This pattern is rooted in what psychologists call a disrupted theory of mind development. In homes where caregivers were inconsistent, children learned that attuning to others was safe and being attuned to was dangerous, because being seen sometimes meant being a burden, a problem, or a trigger for someone else's pain. The brain encoded vulnerability as risk and caregiving as the only acceptable form of emotional transaction. The emotional consequence is a particular form of isolation that hides inside helpfulness. They are surrounded by people who love them and simultaneously unreachable. They have built a life that looks connected from the outside and feels, at the center, profoundly, quietly alone. Not because no one is offering, but because accepting still feels like standing at the edge of something they cannot trust will hold them. The third pattern is one that confuses the people who love them most. It is that intimacy, real intimacy, the kind that asks them to be fully seen, produces not only warmth but a specific, low-grade terror that runs beneath the warmth like a current. The relationship is going beautifully. Their partner is kind, consistent, and present. And then one evening, for no reason they can name, they feel an overwhelming urge to create distance. To pick a small fight. To go quiet for a day. Not because anything is wrong, but because things being right, things being this safe, feels like the highest possible point from which to eventually fall. What is happening is the default mode network, or DMN, the brain's self-referential processing center, running its inherited script. The DMN builds predictions about relationships based on what relationships have historically been. When current experience contradicts the stored template, the brain does not always update the template. Sometimes it tries to make the current experience match the old one instead, because familiarity, even painful familiarity, is neurologically experienced as safety. The emotional consequence is a relationship pattern that feels like sabotage from the inside. They want closeness and create distance. They want stability and engineer uncertainty. They are not broken. They are a person whose nervous system was handed a template for love that included disruption as one of its essential features, and has not yet been shown a version that does not. The fourth pattern is that they live with a baseline level of hypervigilance that most people around them cannot detect and would not believe if they were told about it. They sit in a meeting and monitor every face while also tracking the agenda. They attend a family dinner and regulate their own emotional presentation while simultaneously reading the temperature of every person at the table. They walk into a party already knowing the exits. Not consciously. Not by choice. Their nervous system does this the way a heart beats, automatically, continuously, without permission or rest. The insular cortex, which governs interoception and the brain's processing of bodily signals, is chronically activated in people who grew up in unpredictable environments. The body learned to stay ready. It learned that relaxation had consequences. And so even in objectively safe adult environments, the insular cortex keeps sending the same signal it sent in childhood. Stay alert. The room might change. Be ready when it does. The emotional consequence is a fatigue that has no obvious source. They did not run a marathon. They sat in meetings and had conversations and moved through a normal day. But their nervous system spent that entire day doing a job that other nervous systems were not doing, and the cost of that invisible labor compounds quietly over months and years into an exhaustion that rest alone cannot repair. The fifth pattern is one they are often the last to recognize in themselves. It is that they have an extraordinarily high tolerance for behavior from others that falls below what they deserve, because somewhere in their early formation, insufficient love was the only love consistently available. They stay in friendships that leave them feeling smaller than they were before. They accept treatment from partners that they would immediately recognize as unacceptable if a friend described it to them. They make elaborate internal arguments for why a person's difficult behavior is understandable, explainable, forgivable. They are generous to a fault with people who have given them very little reason to be. This is cognitive empathy operating without boundaries. These individuals understand other people's pain, including the pain of the people who have caused them pain, with a depth that feels instinctive. Because as children, understanding the pain of the adults around them was how they survived it. Compassion was not a virtue they chose. It was a skill they developed in order to predict and manage what was coming. The emotional consequence is that they spend years, sometimes decades, in relationships that confirm the unconscious belief that love requires suffering for it to be real. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because love that arrives easily, without cost or unpredictability, does not yet match the internal template for what love is supposed to feel like. Ease reads as absence. Peace reads as the moment before loss. The sixth pattern is the one that breaks their own heart most quietly. It is that they are deeply, genuinely loving people who struggle, in the privacy of their own minds, to believe that they are lovable at all. They are told they are wonderful. They believe the person means it. But in the quiet of 2 a.m., or in the pause after someone's expression shifts in a way they cannot quite read, the old question surfaces again. Not do they love me, but do they love the version of me they actually know? Because somewhere in them lives the conviction that if someone saw the real version, the unperformed, unmanaged, fully unguarded version, that person would eventually leave too. This core belief is maintained by the DMN running an inherited narrative written in childhood and never formally revised. Mirror neurons, which create the internal experience of being reflected by another person, were calibrated in early life against caregivers who reflected them inconsistently. The result is an adult who has never quite been able to see themselves clearly, because the first mirrors they were given were cracked. The emotional consequence is a love life that is never fully inhabited. They are present, and they are performing presence simultaneously. They are open, and they are monitoring how open they are at all times. They give enormously and secretly keep one foot at the door, not out of dishonesty, but out of a protection so old it has become indistinguishable from who they believe they are. And all of these patterns, the fear of abandonment, the resistance to being cared for, the terror inside intimacy, the invisible hypervigilance, the tolerance for too little, the doubt about their own worth, all of them trace back to the same origin. A nervous system that was asked, before it was finished forming, to do a job it was too young to do. And that did it anyway. Brilliantly. Silently. At enormous cost. And here is what most people never stop to realize about the ones who carry this. They did not survive a broken home because they were lucky. They survived it because they were extraordinary. They built internal structures out of chaos. They learned to love in conditions that were designed to teach them fear. They became, without anyone noticing, some of the most resilient, most perceptive, most deeply human people walking through the world. The fact that they are still standing is not ordinary. It never was. So what can they do? They cannot undo the childhood. They cannot reach back and build the stable home that should have been there. And they cannot simply decide, as an act of will, to stop the patterns that were written into them before they had words for what was happening. But there are 3 practices, grounded in neuroscience and attachment psychology, that create real, lasting change, not overnight, but undeniably. The first principle is to locate the pattern in the past where it actually belongs. The next time the abandonment fear fires in a stable relationship, they pause and name it precisely. This feeling is from 1994, not from today. This is not a dismissal of the feeling. It is a redirection of it. The prefrontal cortex, when engaged deliberately, can begin to distinguish between old signals and present reality, and that distinction is where the first threads of freedom are found. The second principle is to practice receiving in small, deliberate doses. Not grand vulnerability, but small acts of allowing. Letting a friend pay for coffee without deflecting. Saying "I'm having a hard week" to one trusted person without immediately following it with "but I'm fine." Each small act of receiving rewires the brain's prediction about what being cared for leads to. Over time, the nervous system accumulates evidence that counters the old template. Enough evidence, gathered consistently, begins to write a new one. The third principle is reparenting through metacognition, the deliberate observation and redirection of one's own thought patterns. When the inner voice says they will leave or you are too much, they learn to ask, whose voice is this actually? In most cases, it is not their own. It belongs to an environment that no longer exists. Identifying the source of the voice does not silence it immediately, but it removes its authority. A voice that is recognized as borrowed loses much of its power to legislate. When they practice this letting go, not of the past, which cannot be unlocked, but of the obligation to keep living as if the past is still happening, something begins to loosen. The hypervigilance quiets, not completely, but meaningfully. The intimacy terror reduces. They begin to let someone be kind to them and stay in the room while it is happening. They begin to find that safety, real safety, does not have to feel like the moment before loss. They were never a broken home in human form. They were a house that was built in a storm by someone with no blueprint and no shelter, and still, somehow, they built walls that held. What they need now is not to be rebuilt from scratch. They need only to let someone hold the door open long enough to see that the storm, the original one, has been over for a very long time. And the warmth they have been carrying for everyone else was always, first, meant for them. These are people who think deeply, love fiercely, and show up for others with a consistency that is nothing short of remarkable, given what they were shown. They are not the product of their breaking. They are the proof of what survived it. They do not need to be fixed. They need to be finally, fully, without condition, met. If this feels familiar, leave a comment about which pattern fits you most, or share one word that describes what it felt like growing up. Because every honest word left here is a small act of reclaiming a voice that was quieted too early, and someone watching this right now needs to know that their experience was real, their resilience is remarkable, and they are not alone in any of it. If this video helped you feel seen, or helped you understand someone you love a little more deeply, please press like and share it with a friend who might be carrying this quietly. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to subscribe, because every week we go into the psychology of the human experience, the parts that are hardest to name, most necessary to understand, and most worthy of the gentleness we so freely give to everyone but ourselves.